Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, back again. Here with a couple viewer questions, and I'll try to blast through a couple of them in this particular video. As always, reach out to me. You know where, bishopshomegrown@gmail.com, and or YouTube comments below, and or social media, and I'll do my best to answer your questions about home distilling and or professional distilling. So I have a malolactic question from Ron Ford here, who says, "Hey Alan, I'm having issues trying to infect the next runs with lactobacillus. I have a bucket of back set that has the infection, and I add 2 gallons of it to my next mash. I do replace the back set with every run, and it keeps growing lacto. When mashing in, I'm adding the infected back set to the mash right before adding the yeast and giving it a final mixing. At the end of fermentation, and the cap has fallen, I'm not seeing the infection on top of the mash. This leads me to believe I'm doing it incorrectly. What are the correct steps on infecting the next batch?" So one thing I notice here is that you are adding it before you add your yeast. And you should be getting plenty of lactobacillus if you're adding it before you add your yeast, absolutely. It's a little risky though. What I would suggest is add your yeast, let fermentation get going, and let it go for about 24 hours before you add that malolactic bacteria to it. So that way you don't have to worry about that malolactic bacteria outcompeting your yeast in any way, shape, or form, and or crashing your pH. Just because you're not seeing the lactic form on top of the mash, that's not a bad thing. Usually if you're starting to see lactic actually form on top of the mash, you've let it go for too long. And the bad thing about malolactic bacteria is that if you let it go too long, you can sort of get this kind of stale ramen sort of note that's not very good in grain whiskey. But for example, with what I do at work, and I inoculate, what I do is, it is kind of hard to explain. So let me kind of take you through the process. So I have a 600 gallon cooker, 1200 gallon fermenters. I fill a half fermenter each day. So basically I make 1 cooker full each day. Day 1, I use my house yeast that we use to pull out the grain forward profile of the whiskey that we're making. Day 2, I will use a brandy yeast of one way, shape, form, variety, or the other to pull out the more fruity profiles. After we add that brandy yeast and it gets going, then we add an actual pure cheese culture malolactic. And you can buy these from various cheese stores out there. Look into them. They're thermophilic bacteria, basically malolactic bacterias. We don't ever get any lactic on top of our fermentations at ever. I mean, we've never seen it, not one time, and we try to avoid that for the reason I just said a while ago. But we do know that we do have that malolactic there because we keep track of our pH. Always keep track of your pH with malolactic bacteria. If malolactic bacteria is working the correct way and you are mashing in without sour mashing, for example, you should see your pH after about the 3rd day of fermentation start to drop fairly dramatically. So if you're at 5.5 starting off, by the 3rd day, you're probably going to be in the 4s, is my guess. Maybe even a little further down. The other thing you can do is make a run that has no malolactic bacteria to it, and make one that does have malolactic bacteria, distill them, and then compare them. If you have good malolactic bacteria there, you're going to notice a thicker mouthfeel. You're going to notice a lot heavier, earthier, darker tonalities come across in that particular product than you will in the one without lactic bacteria. So just because you're not seeing that lactic bacteria growing on top of the mash doesn't mean that it's not there and it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's probably there and it's probably doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. And it's probably in such amounts that you're doing it exactly correctly. Again, if you start to see that web growing on the top, you can still distill that. And sometimes it does make good whiskey. But oftentimes it can get super, super funky. So don't be disappointed by that whatsoever. The one thing I would suggest, though, is try to find yourself a really good malolactic bacteria culture. Some of them will actually work in symbiosis with yeast if you're propagating your own yeast. In other words, the yeast will always get 3/4 of the way through fermentation before the malolactic bacteria wakes up and starts to drop pH. And it kind of helps preserve the yeast by keeping other microbes out of it. I can't remember if it's MM100 or MM1000. It's one of the two. And one of those 2 numbers doesn't exist, just so you know. I can't remember which one it is, though. But that is a thermophilic lactic culture for cheese making that you can look up. Is one I've used many times with great success, and you can culture it alongside your yeast if you are propagating your own yeast and keep it going over and over and over again throughout the generations very successfully. It's one that I use all the time, both on a home scale and a professional distilling scale. So I think I got your question answered there, I hope. If not, you reach out to me and you let me know, and we will dive that much deeper into that question for sure. All right, so I got another question here from, excuse me, Ian Trotter. Good day, Alan. I have a question I hope you can answer in one of your YouTube videos. After 3 years of using my current copper pot still setup, my last run has come out with a greenish-blue tinge. I normally do grain mashes and molasses wash. This time was a spent grain and sugar wash as an experimental. I ran the stripping run hard and fast and collected it all into a glass flagon. I don't know if I'm saying that word right. Probably not, knowing me. It has a greenish-blue tinge and some dropout or cloudy stuff in the bottom similar to fusel oils. I've never experienced this before and have read about copper sulfates coming through from the still. How can I clean my still effectively to remedy this? I clean my still with boiling water straight after each run and have never had an issue. So it does sound to me like you do have a little bit of copper sulfate. If you have enough that's starting to show up actually in your distillate at the end, there's a buildup of it somewhere in your system. Typically that tends to be in your worm if you have a serpentine coil or a worm coil. My suggestion is, and there's nothing wrong with cleaning out your still with boiling water after each run, but it doesn't also hurt to hit that with a acid rinse, followed by a more, what's the word I'm looking for? Detergent rinse, right? So we've talked about here on the channel before, the way that I clean stills at work is by doing steam outs. So I'll do a steam out with citric acid and water, and then I'll do a steam out with soda ash and our powdered brewer's wash and water, and then I'll do a steam out with just straight boiling water, and that keeps a vast majority of that copper sulfate out of the system. But you're definitely going to want to acid wash everything that you have. I would use citric acid and or vinegar, something like that, and just boil it through real hard and real fast. Don't bother to try to condense that vapor down. Just let it blow off as hard as what it'll possibly do, and that should get you good and cleaned out. Now, it is normal to pull even little flakes of copper sulfate over, even in a clean still from time to time. That's a pretty normal thing, especially if you're bouncing around between various different products, like it sounds like you hit rum, etc. So you're hitting several different pHs, and you are likely to see some of that. One of the things that you can do to prevent that from getting into your product is to get some unbleached toilet paper, unbleached coffee filters, whatever, and put that underneath your output on your condenser so that anything that comes out gets caught in there. When you talk about seeing some of the stuff kind of floating in the bottom that's got copper sulfate attached to it, that's probably some of your long chain fatty acids, and there's nothing wrong with those long chain fatty acids. I believe we've talked about the difference between chill filtering and non-chill filtering on this channel before, and those long chain fatty acids definitely fall out of suspension when things get colder. Copper sulfate also attaches itself to those long chain fatty acids, and I can give you an example of having seen that many times. Well, one time in a major way though. So at the previous distillery that I worked at, we actually didn't do any fermentation on site, and we didn't even do stripping runs on site. So we bought in grape brandy low wines from out in California, and occasionally the guys in California didn't do a great job of rinsing their stills out after cleaning, etc., or in between runs. And so the low wines would come in and you'd see all long chain fatty acid floating on top of the low wines, and it would all be blue instead of being white as it should be. It's usually white and kind of for lack of any better word, and this sounds disgusting, but kind of like a mucusy sort of consistency. You'd see the blue floating in it. You'd go to distill out across on a double pot still, and it would still come across and be blue even if your still was clean. And the problem was all those long chain fatty acids would fall out. You'd hold the bottle up and you can see the fatty acids floating in there. That's fine if they're the normal color. You just tell people, oh, you shake it back up, it goes back in. It's part of your flavor profile, right? But if that shit's blue and it looks like blue boogers, people are not going to buy that bottle. And we had, I think it was 5,000 gallons of low wine one time that was just inundated with that stuff. And yeah, had to do a lot of filtration to get that out of there. We didn't catch it initially when we redistilled it, and we got ready to bottle that stuff, and we found it. We ended up having to plate and frame filter that stuff in order to get it out of there. So that's pretty common when you have long chain fatty acids coming across in a distillation. If there's copper sulfate in there, that's where it's going to catch, that's where it's going to come across, that's what it's going to stick to because the surface area, etc. So the big thing is, as you're already doing, you clean your still out with water as soon as you run it. But every few, weeks, months, depending on how often you run. So I run, let's say on a doubling still, usually 3 to 4 times a week at my current distillery. And I will typically do that hard boil out that we just mentioned citric acid, followed by a boil out with powdered brewer's wash, followed by a boil out with water. We'll usually do that every couple weeks, or if we're getting ready to switch products. If we're going from one mash bill to another mash bill, it doesn't hurt to clean that still real heavy in between. So just every once in a while, and you'll know when it needs to be done. Run that cycle, and you'll see a whole lot less of that copper sulfate. All right, guys, that's all I got for now, and we'll be back momentarily. Well, I'll be back momentarily to record a video that you'll get in a few days after this video, because that's how it works. Brain a little slow right now. So, all right, love y'all. Later.